Women are like lambs being sent to slaughter. And who's going to pick up the pieces? It's not going to be the abortion industry that is paid for them. It is the pro-life movement. We step up gladly to help them. Welcome to Straight Talk on Life Issues. We're really pleased to have you with us during this particularly special program today. I'm Brad Mattis, president of Life Issues Institute.
And I'm your co-host, Victor Nieves. Today we're discussing an important new study, in fact, the largest of its kind, highlighting the dangers of chemical abortion. Analysts from the Ethics and Public Policy Center studied actual insurance claims of more than 865,000 women who used the chemical abortion drug between 2017 and 2023. That makes this the most comprehensive analysis of the quote-unquote safety of the chemical abortion drug ever conducted in this nation.
Yeah, Victor, this is a gift from heaven for those of us who are combating this deadly and dangerous drug. There were key findings that they found during the analysis, and one of them is that women are at least 22 times more likely to experience serious complications of chemical abortion than the FDA's label claims of 0.05.
Well, and I think it's so important, Brad, a sticking point to me when we see this study is we have obviously two separate claims. We have what the FDA is claiming, which we know is bogus, but then we have the claim that's really not a claim. It's more of just an observation. This is real world data. You really can't argue with this. There's one world that might point to a very controlled scientific study environment where all of these certain pieces are lined up in a specific way. And of course, the abortion industry, the people selling these pills, they're going to want to find, it's like the cigarette industry trying to put out a study saying, oh, cigarettes are healthy. Of course, many of those involved with the abortion pill are going to do the same thing. But what we have here in this data set isn't a controlled setting. It's not what they can have their hands on. This is real world. This is what has actually happened in real life. So to try and argue with it, if you're one of these pro-abortion folks, if you're trying to say that chemical abortion is safe, we have the data, a tremendously, tremendously large set of data from the real world. I don't know how FDA, I don't know how anyone could ignore that this is what is really happening, actually taking place.
Well, let's talk about some of the findings that they had here. 1 in 10 women face serious medical consequences, like I said before. And just to show you how serious they are, we're talking about sepsis, a blood infection, which is life-threatening unless it's treated quickly, general infection, hemorrhaging, transfusion requiring added blood because the women have been bleeding so severely, hospitalization and ER visit to the hospitals. There are cases of ectopic pregnancies that were not caught during the abortion for chemical abortion because it was mailed to them with no medical supervision whatsoever. And there are what they called other things they're calling threatening adverse events. Now, one of the other things we found through this analysis, Victor, is that 1 in 20 women who take this drug have to go in for another abortion attempt. Sometimes they opt for a second chemical abortion. Other times they opt for surgical abortion. And this is a fairly common ramification or complication of this pill, if you will. And that's because parts of the baby and or placenta was left behind that the chemical abortion pill could not clean the uterus. So it is fairly common that this would occur, as you see, 1 in 20.
Well, and that totals about 7,000 women. So for anybody who might think, oh, well, 1 in 20, that might not be, it's very common. This happened to 7,000 women. Again, getting back to the lived experience, to imagine a detractor of this study or of this finding, someone who would try and minimize its significance. Imagine them standing in a room with 7,000 women who did experience this, the 7,000 women who actually are living their lives following this, who then had to go through the trauma, the horrors of a failed first attempt to follow it up with a second attempt, they'd be hard pressed and probably pretty red in the cheeks if they were to stand in an auditorium with 7,000 women who actually experienced this and tell them that it's not a big deal. That's a huge deal.
Well, what's interesting is how did we get to this point? How did we get to the point where so many women were suffering, coming close to death? Here's the thing. In 2015, the FDA, in cooperation with the Obama and Biden administration, began hiding from public view any complications of this drug unless the woman dies. So, Victor, let's say she goes in and there is an incomplete abortion. She has sepsis, which is life-threatening. She has to go to the intensive care unit. She spends 10 days there requiring blood transfusions and ultimately the removal of her uterus to save her life. You know what? The FDA does not care. They don't require abortionists or legitimate hospitals working feverishly to save these women's lives to report the serious atrocities being inflicted on the health and well-being of women who take these dangerous drugs. And of course, the baby dies. We don't want to forget that. All the FDA wants to know is if the woman dies. So as a result, you get that skewed FDA amount of 0.05 on the label, which is absolutely false. It's based on a couple of outdated studies with a tiny fraction of the number of women in this new analysis. And you know, the thing is, I think they know it. I think they know they're cooking the numbers to make this dangerous drug seem like a panacea for women who don't want to be pregnant.
If we were to be extremely generous and we were to try to play devil's advocate in our mind and try and come up with some sort of a justification for this, why would the FDA, because it seems so counterintuitive to the mission, I mean, the whole mission, the reason that we have an FDA ought to be to make sure that dangerous drugs and things like that aren't, for example, killing people, maiming people. Can you come up with any explanation that would justify it? It seems silly to even say this, to justify the FDA removing the reporting requirement. That just seems like it's opening the door, maybe intentionally, to this kind of a problem where now you have women who are not informed and you have these skewed statistics, like you said. Is there any reason that we could ever come up with for why they would do that?
Yes, there is one. It's a reason that will expose them as being on the wrong side of history and an enemy of women. It's to change the political, medical, and ethical abortion landscape on their deceitful terms. They think this will change the way Americans will look at abortion. Just pop a pill and the pregnancy goes away. But in usual far-left fashion, they ignore medical, political, and ethical realities that are now just coming out. They don't want women to know the dangers they potentially face if they take this drug. Of course, the baby dies every time, which bears repeating. And when the mothers and fathers see what they were told is a mass of tissue turn out to be a real baby, they are traumatized for life. Clearly, in my opinion, this was a cover-up involving President Obama, President Biden, and the previous FDA. And they will all be judged to be on the wrong side of history when their hidden, dirty little secrets are exposed. The truth always wins out. It may take time, but it'll happen. And for the sake of women and their unborn babies, we must work to make it happen soon.
Well, I think you're right. I mean, that it's the only, no matter how generous I try to be, it's the only explanation that I can personally come up with is there's a lot of money. And you have to believe if you put yourself in the shoes of a woman who's scared, she's confused, she's facing a pregnancy that maybe she didn't intend to, she didn't plan, etc. If you were to sit her down before you could give her these pills, which we'll talk about this later, but the distribution of these pills is a nightmare in and of itself. There's basically no meaningful medical oversight anymore. But if you were to tell a woman who's contemplating this chemical abortion, the information that we now have available, the information that I believe the FDA has intentionally turned a blind eye to and tried to hide, tried to avoid. If you told that woman, hey, listen, 1 in 10 women who have done what you're considering doing faced serious consequences like sepsis and other infections and things of that nature, or had to go back and attempt to do a second abortion. I just don't think that very many women would want to go through it. And that kind of highlights an issue of informed consent. Do you think that these women who have not had access for the longest time to some of this data, do you think any of them were truly given informed consent before they were handed a dangerous pill?
Absolutely not, because I've talked to enough women who have taken the pill and regretted it. They said, for instance, Victor, they said that it's not a baby, it's just a mass of tissue, that it'll be just a heavy period, that it won't be very painful. It's a more natural approach. Well, the story from women who have taken this drug is entirely different. Elizabeth Gillette, a good friend of mine, has gone on video with us describing her experience. And what they were alarmed at is as that baby passed from their body, that dead baby, they held in their hands not a mass of tissue, but a baby with hands and feet, fingers and toes and eyes, a nose. And that is an absolute devastating thing for them to come face to face with. And then you know what? Their bathroom and their bedroom is a point in their home where that will remind them, that will trigger them as a home abortion. And they don't have anyone to blame because the abortionist didn't do it to them. They took the pill. That's an added burden for them. And that is something that will not go away easily.
And it is worth mentioning that there are healing programs out there, but it takes a lot of work. We've spoken, Brad, to the women who have experienced this firsthand and we've shared their stories, but we've also shared how long in many cases that path to healing is. And again, that's something that's not shared with these women before they go in, that, hey, this could be a years long process of trying to recover from an abortion that happened in your home. They have to dispose of the body of their baby. It's really terrible stuff. As always, here on Straight Talk on Life Issues, we make sure to provide you with free resources and information. You can find all of that on our website, lifeissues.org, so you can take this information and share it with your friends and your family. Again, that's available at lifeissues.org. Well, Brad, let's talk about what the analysts recommended, right? When we get this data set and we look at it, they had a couple of suggestions, and I think that to the average person, these are pretty no-brainers. I think personally, I would go much further. Obviously, the abortion pill is a terrible thing. It should be taken off the market entirely. But they just look at it and they say, purely for the sake of the woman here, there needs to be, for example, required in-person office visits, 3 of them, in-person office visits to make sure that there's not something, for example, like an ectopic pregnancy. They want to make sure that these dangerous drugs are only prescribed by physicians. We know that the abortion industry has tried to expand the scope of who can provide abortions, who can do abortions, well beyond just what you would think to be medical professionals. They also recommend, and again, this seems to be a no-brainer, that if these pills are going to be happening, administered only in an abortion facility, a medical office, a hospital. Let's talk about that because that ties back directly to the trauma these women experience and then a trauma point being formed in their home. What do you think it would do to the abortion industry and specifically the chemical pills if we no longer allowed this ridiculous mail-out application of these drugs and said that women actually had to go into a facility, a medical office, a hospital, etc.?
Well, it would pretty much kill the chemical abortion industry because right now, as you said, they're mailing pills from India, from China, from different points in the USA. There is no medical guidance or information. And as you're talking about what the panel analysts recommended, let's look back at the original research that was done on the chemical abortion pill. Those who did that were adamant that this be done in a medical environment with repeated personal visits. And one of them said the worst thing that can happen is that this pill would be used out of a medical environment. And as you said, that's exactly what's being done. Women are like lambs being sent to slaughter. And who's going to pick up the pieces? It's not going to be the abortion industry that is paid for them. It is the pro-life movement. We step up gladly to help them. But this is more challenging in some ways, the abortion pill, than it is for surgical abortion.
Well, and it's important that you mentioned, those original studies, the guidance of the original studies, because there is a lot of a parallel here. And what some people may not know, when the original FDA approval of Mifepristone, when that first came into the United States and we started tragically allowing this death drug to be sent out, those French studies were the backbone of all of this. And since then, we've seen the FDA and different administrations move away from anything that would resemble a safeguard. They have just gone highway speed to try and strip this off. It wasn't that long ago that you could not mail these pills out because there was an understanding of just how dangerous it was. But it seems that there's been a very concentrated effort to just remove any kind of a guardrail, to remove any kind of a safety net that would exist when we're talking about the application of this pill, which again, I want to see removed completely from the market. But when we're talking about the application of the pill, those safeguards would exist exclusively to protect the mother. These are things that were put in place to make sure, for example, a woman wasn't taking these drugs well in excess of the gestational age that was going to be approved. That's why there might be an in-person requirement, and you don't just mail them out willy-nilly. What do you think about that we've seen this neck break speed trying to just throw off any of those safety protections for the woman?
Well, it clearly demonstrates, Victor, where their concerns lie. It's all with the abortion industry making money from those pills going out and furthering a radical pro-abortion agenda. You hit on the gestational limitation that was originally there. They said that it should only be for pregnancies no longer than 7 weeks. Let me tell you about a recent story that came to light. There were two university students attending universities far apart from each other. They managed to come together long enough to begin a pregnancy. So over the phone, they talked about what they would do, eventually landing on a chemical abortion. Now, she was 17 weeks pregnant. They were told it's not a baby. When that child came out of her body, that was absolutely destroying her psyche as well as his. He went posted on Reddit asking for advice of things that he could do to help her. Well, the best thing he could have done was stand up for that baby and her and said, "We're going to do this together." But his comment was, "We had no idea when they saw that baby." Now, that is perhaps willful ignorance, but many students at that age aren't thinking about the ramifications and long-term effect, and that's why there need to be minimally safeguards to protect them. Like you, I don't think the pill should be available at all, but some basic things need to be put in place to protect the health and mental well-being of both the mothers and the fathers.
And it's worth mentioning as it relates to that story. I think it highlights obviously a number of things, one of which is the tremendous influence, I believe, that these so-called medical experts and the propaganda from the abortion industry that can influence people to do things that they otherwise would not do. If you're in an emergency situation or what you perceive to be an emergency, you're very stressed, you're very unsure of what to do, and then you have an authority figure in society come to you, because this is very prevalent when it comes to the medical community. It's also seen on college campuses where you have professors and people who are supposed to be someone that you can kind of glean information from. When they look you in the eye and they say, no, don't worry about it. This isn't, it's not a child. This is just a clump of cells. And then you act on that information. They leave you to deal with the consequences. As you said, they don't pick up the pieces. They leave you stranded all by yourself to deal with the consequences of this terrible thing that they told you to do. They told you it wasn't a big deal. So then if you can convince people, oh, it's just a clump of cells, it's not really a child, it distorts their view of reality significantly. And then when reality comes crashing in on them, it's very difficult to deal with. Like you mentioned, that young man going to Reddit and asking what he could do. Well, unfortunately, the damage has been done in this case. Now they have to pick up the pieces. They should reach out and seek post-abortion healing. Brad, I'm reminded as well, as we speak about the topic of chemical abortion, I want our listener to know that there is hope with abortion pill reversal. We'll have resources on our website, lifeissues.org, for abortion pill reversal. Maybe if that young man would have reached out very, very quickly, they could have had access to that. But that's another thing that, another topic maybe for another day, but how they try to hide any information that could potentially save these young people from the damage of an abortion. They want this abortion to be done. They want these young people, these young women, to be aborting their children. And it's an absolute tragedy.
For decades, Victor, pro-abortion activists have railed against illegal back alley coat hanger abortions. Well, guess what? Now they're advocating for that exactly. Only the coat hanger is now a chemical coat hanger with chemical abortion drugs. They are mailing them into states that have laws protecting unborn children and their mothers, and they are doing tens of thousands of destructive behavior to those couples, those vulnerable women and men, mothers and fathers, who are totally devastated at the outcome. And we need to let more people know that devastation is there if they go into this ignorant.
Absolutely. And that kind of segues to an important question, Brad. What would you like to see? We have Robert Kennedy Jr. as HHS Secretary. What would you like to see him do, the FDA do, with this information? Because as we've laid out, it's really undeniable. There's no questioning this is lived experience. This is real insurance data. No doubt there's going to be people who support abortion. They're in lockstep with abortion that will try to find some sort of a criticism of it. But at the end of the day, we're talking about real world lived experience, insurance data. This is what's actually happening. So taking this information, for one, what do you expect to see happen? But what would be the perfect, what do you think would be the ideal scenario for Kennedy to do with this information?
Well, I've joined several other pro-life leaders, and we sent a letter very recently to Secretary Kennedy and to Dr. McKay, the commissioner of the FDA, asking them to take a look at the research and really taking an unbiased approach to this chemical abortion pill and acting on the dangers that they are imposing to women.
And Brad, it's been one of the major pushes of this administration, specifically of Secretary Kennedy, that we want to make America healthy again. And I think most people agree with that idea that we have a country that's deeply unhealthy in many ways. And you have to look at the abortion component of that. Abortion leaves, as we've said many times, a path of destruction in its wake. And as we've outlined today, an FDA should know, especially inside of this recent study, the devastation that it's inflicting on, obviously, the unborn child, but the women and also the men, the family members, the entire sphere of influence that abortion touches is oftentimes devastated by the impact of this. And going back to the Make America Healthy Again agenda, with that being such an essential point of Robert Kennedy's goals, I'm very hopeful, I'm prayerfully optimistic that we will see him take action on this. These pills should not be given to these women, certainly not under the current circumstances.
They shouldn't be given at all, as we've said throughout this program, because they are so dangerous and wretched, and what it imposes, death on the baby and absolutely emotional devastation on the women. So what you, the listener, can do with us is make sure that everybody gets this information, share this program with them, and let them know the stark realities of what chemical abortion is doing to countless women and men and babies.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. We'll have all of that information free, available to you on our website, lifeissues.org. Again, that's lifeissues.org. You can learn more about the chemical abortion. You can learn more about this recent study that we've been discussing today. You'll also find on our website ways that you can take action and encourage Congress and Kennedy, et cetera, to make sure that they are protecting women. Because as we've said, this is truly a no-brainer. If you care about women, we should not be exposing them to the dangers of chemical abortion. Again, that's on our website, lifeissues.org. Be sure to tune in next week for another Straight Talk on Life Issues.